This is fine.
Okay, we're now live on Facebook and on Zoom. Over to you, Erin Sullivan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for showing up and doing all the work that you've done. I know that you have done it because that's the kind of people that we are, is we're really into doing our work and our research really intensively. And when I picked the title, because as the sort of panel moderator, I chose titles, and I chose Unity in Duality, Planetary Pairs, for various reasons. And it actually just sort of flew out of my mind, and I thought, okay, now I've done it. I've set up a topic that could be problematic, but it really doesn't prove that to me. And the first planets that I thought about that I wanted to talk about were the Mercury-Venus ones. Because they're in between us and the sun, therefore they're our most personal planets, and they are a pair. And in fact, Hermes and Aphrodite did have a connection, a relationship, and they have a child named the hermaphrodite. And so when you put the Hermes Mercury together, Hermes and Aphrodite together, you end up with a kind of androgynous ideal. But the thing is, each one of them have very, very distinct characteristics, and it's important to recognize that that's the case. And that when I look at Venus, for example, I think of her in two forms, because both of these planets rule two signs. And Mercury rules, of course, Gemini and Virgo, as we know. And Venus rules Taurus and Libra. So they each rule air signs and earth signs. And it really makes a difference in the interpretation when we're looking at horoscopes. Which whereabouts do we find Hermes and Mercury and Venus together? And Aphrodite is an interesting planet in herself, because she is Urania. She's Aphrodite Urania. She is her father's daughter. She was born out of the castration of Uranus by Saturn, Kronos, and she was born out of and came rising up out of the sea foam, like the famous Botticelli painting, on a seashell. And so she is two goddesses. She is both Urania of the heavens and Pandemos of the human quality. And Hermes is many aspects, but teacher, trickster, and theos. He's a teacher, he's a trickster, and he's a god. And in fact, he's the god who would take the people who have died, flittering and wittering down into the underworld to join Hades in his domain. And so he has a lot to do with death as well as life. And being a Hermes, the myth story, the birth stories, where he goes back to his babyhood. When he was first an infant, he was always a trickster from the very beginning. And Apollo had this a wonderful collection of herd of white cows, and Hermes decided that he would play a trick, and he was still a baby, an infant in his little cradle, but he turned the hooves of the cattle backwards and walked them into this cave. And so when Apollo came to look for his white cattle, Hermes says there aren't any. They've disappeared. They seem to have gone into this cave. And it turns out, of course, that he had tricked him. And Apollo, rather than diminishing him or getting rid of him, as often gods do, he thought he was hilarious. And Apollo and Hermes, or Mercury, are very close in their birth stories. And so when I look at Hermes also, he's a god in the sense that he rules crossroads. And in ruling crossroads, all major crossroads had a kind of a stone, um, uh, a stone marking that marked the crossroads, and they were called herms because it was at every crossroads that you go through. Hermes is the guide, and there are, of course, 4 directions in every crossroads. Hermes is not the only god of the crossroads, but also he's many other things. He's a ruler of Gemini, which has to do with the mind and the frontal place and the frontal part of the brain. And he also rules Virgo, which is the gut and the body. So he's both embodied and also intellectually accurate. I mean, he is, Gemini and Virgo. Mercury ruling Gemini is the thinker. Mercury ruling Virgo is the one who responds to information or food or whatever is being put into the mind or the body. The gut will either reject or accept it. And so, Mercury is really important in health issues as well. So Hermes himself, being teacher, teaches us our stories about all of the gods and the goddesses and the beginning of time. And I looked at Venus, and I noticed that she too has a dual nature. She's both Urania and Pandemos, which means that when she was born, she was cut from the castrated, birthed out of the castration of Chrono, of Urania, of the sky, the heavens, and she sailed in on the sea. But she's also Pandemos, which literally means of the people. And she's really an interesting goddess because she rules 2 signs, like Hermes does. She rules the body in the sense of it being the place that we incarnate our container. And she's also to do with the integration of the body and values, because she rules Venus, which is the other. And so on one hand, it's a very intellectual planet, but on the other hand, it's also very physical. And that's what Mercury and Venus both share astrologically. And so when we look at what our life purpose is, say, to try and integrate our body with our values, in other words, our actual integration of the mind, the body, the soul, we look to Venus to do this, because in the Socratic dialogues, there was one in the symposium where and the Socratic dialogues were actually really just drunken parties for guys who sat around philosophizing and basically talking about women and various other topics. But they would always talk about a theme. And in the Socratic theme that I'm talking about has to do with the discussion of love. And that there are 2 kinds of love, that there's the Uranian love, which is this without sex, and the pandemic or pandemos love, which is sexual. So there's two forms of femininity in Venus, as well as the 2 forms of femininity and masculinity in Hermes. In Venus, she has to do with both the body and the soul. And she has a very interesting aspect in this Socratic dialogue on love, that the woman there's 2 types of women. One is the pandemic one, pandemos, that has the babies and gives birth and marries and looks after children. And then there's the more philosophizing one, the one that brings, according to the Socratic method, is that she encourages us to think in higher philosophical terms. So we're either embodied with Venus, Pandemos, or we are participating in philosophy as the feminine side of thinking. And so philosophy means too that having, of course, had a child between the two of them, Mercury and Venus, we had Hermes and Aphrodite come together, and of course, the hermaphrodite is their child. And so there's the gender issue that arises very often between the differences of Mercury and Venus. Like if you're looking at a chart, you need to consider the possibility that it's not just about Venus being the feminine and Mercury being the masculine, because they both rule a feminine sign and a masculine sign. Mercury, rules Gemini, and it rules Virgo, and Venus rules Taurus, and it rules Libra. And so we're getting two very different types of personalities and personae in both of those planets. And when they come together, they are about the socialization of the mind. How do we think in terms that were, workable for the rest of the world? How do we, integrate ourselves into a group of people, for example? Mercury and Venus are both very necessary for not just social reasons, but also for spiritual reasons. Hermes was considered to be the god of the mind, as opposed to the god of the soul and the body, which is Venus in ancient mythology. And so she's both, capable of birthing babies, but also she's the one that Socrates would have said should be looked at as the higher mind, as the feminine aspect of the mind, where it comes in with the greatest ideas. And the one thing of Venus that's very interesting, and this I think you should do when we're done, is every 8 years, Venus goes retrograde in the same sign. Now, that happens for about many decades. So if you go back at this point, because Venus is about to go direct on the 25th of June, and Mercury is about to go retrograde on the 18th. So we get both of them are moving in each direction. Venus is currently right now, June 11th of 2020, it's currently in Gemini. It will spend almost 8 months in the sign of Gemini, because it was retrograde in its 40 days of 40 nights, which is quite biblical. And it's about to go direct in 2 weeks. And Mercury, the god of the trickster figure, he goes direct on the 18th. So and they're both going on in the same period of time. And so I didn't know any of this when I just thought, well, maybe I could discuss a bit about Venus and Mercury as being a pair. And I didn't realize at the time, because this was months ago, that this is the synchrony of it. And Hermes, Mercury, is actually in Cancer. And Venus will spend 8 months in the sign of Gemini, which is Hermes's sign. So there's something going on here between the pandemic side of what Venus has to offer. I mean, there's a lot of root words. I mean, Venus is her sort of verbal history has cognates like venal and venereal and vein and vent, invent, advent. It has to do with viruses. And it was very interesting when I noticed on March the 8th that we had a Sun-Neptune exactly conjunct, along with Mercury and Uranus exactly conjunct on the same day in March the 8th. And that was the beginning of when we found out that there was a pandemic. And so when we think in terms of Mercury and Venus working together, and she's Pandemos of the people, as well as Urania of the mind, and he's the trickster and the teacher, it makes sense that the air sign is dominant, that there is a pandemic at this point. I mean, when we think of Venus Pandemos, we're thinking of Venus Pandemos as of the people. So a pandemic is an absolute context of entire global, well, Venusian cognates, like virus is another Venusian cognate. So looking at the two of them, they work together, but they also work, in some ways in opposition, because on one hand, that we always think in terms of Venus as being very wanting to balance things. Well, that's true in the Libran sense, but when it comes to the embodiment, it's really about, the feminine function in both men and women and their desire to create, to be creative. And Hermes is exactly the same in the sense that through the either verbal or artistic or creative or writing, the Hermes has to do with our whole idea and the way we think, and how he is both trickster and teacher and God, Theos, and Venus being both Urania and Pandemos of the heavens, but also of the earth, of the earthy one. And so when we see Venus go direct on the 25th, we're going to mention she will be remaining in Gemini for quite some time. And that's, that is ruled by Mercury, who will then have gone retrograde. And so what we end up with is about 8 months of Venus in Gemini, which is the pandemic that's going on at this time, this COVID-19, that isn't actually airborne. But it passes through the air, but it's through natural, secretions of the body. It isn't an airborne issue, but it can be borne through the air only if the person that they're with is contagious. And so we think in terms of, well, if this is a time of great fear and anxiety, and also a time of isolation, we're finding that Hermes and Venus are not really getting what they need as far as attention, group organizational stuff. Well, we're doing something now that works really well because we can talk to each other, we can see each other, there's a relationship being carried on. So the fact that both of the gods, Venus, goddess of Urania, and Pandemos, of the heavens and of the earth, and Hermes, the trickster and the teacher, ruling all crossways, like a door. I mean, what you might even want to do is sort of bless your doorway as you pass through it, because you're crossing the threshold. So Hermes has to do with crossing thresholds, and he protects the home as a herm, the Gemini, the more Virgo side of the Gemini function of Mercury. So that wherever we go, we're always going to be interactive in some way on a social level. And that's going to have two levels of it. One will be either, very physical, and another one will be very intellectual. One is Taurus and one is Venus. And with Mercury, Hermes, we get Gemini, thinking, the mind, the frontal lobe, the place. Whereas the Virgo part of Mercury has more to do with the intestinal tract. So that, for instance, digestion isn't just about eating food and digesting it. It's about if you hear or are talking with someone and you can't digest what they're saying, it has to do with that as well. The capacity to be able to relate in ways which are acceptable and understandable to other people. And so there's, as the soul guide, as I said, he's the one who took, say, the soldiers of Troy down into the underworld, sort of as it says in the book, wittering and twittering all the way down into the underworld. And as such, he is the psychopompus, which is the soul guide. So he also offers us our capacity to convey our deep values, our relationship, and really our kind of incarnate purpose between the two, Venus and Mercury. Those are the two planets that are really very personal because they fall between us on planet Earth and our solar image, our solar system. So they are the two matching pairs, the masculine, the feminine. They're both masculine and feminine. They're really shapeshifters, both planets, Venus and Mercury. And so I was thinking, I wonder what you guys would think about that. Because when I think in terms of the two of them together, and the fact that right now, and this was picked months ago, that right now we have Venus stationary direct coming up in Gemini and Mercury station retrograde coming up in Cancer. And this is all happening as we speak. Just they're stationing in each direction as we speak, because this is now the week before Mercury goes to retrograde, and the next week Venus will go direct. So we're, really in between, a major shift in our consciousness based upon Hermes and also the trickster of perhaps even getting misinformation. So we have to be very careful about what we hear. And I just heard a bell. And so that means that I don't need to go on any further, but I'd love to hear what other people have got as their pairs and what they picked and why. So go ahead and let's go on to our speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erin. That was a great topic of Venus and Mercury, starting out with the first two. Excuse me, I am going to put on my PowerPoint, share, and start slideshow. There we go. So my topic today are the big daddies, Jupiter and Saturn. Here on our left, we have Saturn as in Capricorn, Jupiter in Capricorn, and then we have Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. Not knowing which side of the road they want to cross at this point, I guess. So first thing I want to say is, the first thing I think of when I consider Jupiter is I think of, just like this buoyant lifting up, this force that elevates us, that makes us think of something more, something greater than ourselves. And then, of course, after we get full of ourselves in that kind of a way, we have Saturn, which tends to bring us down. It's the outer ring, the ring that passes not. And what I like to say with these two is, which is bad? The inhale or the exhale? Because that's what Jupiter and Saturn really are, right? Jupiter's that expansion. Is that when we fill ourselves up with air, we go, make ourselves as big as possible. And then Saturn's that part where we just exhale and we get right back down to it. But, we live in a society that tends to consider that the inhale or the aggrandizement, the expression, the expansion of the self is really what we hear about. But if that was the case, then why would we have Saturn just on the other side of that saying, wait a minute, you guys, it's time to come back to reality. It's great to have these wonderful, great, lofty ideas, but without grounding them into the reality of life, you really might not get as far as you might want to go. And it's really important, just like Erin said with her pair, these two also have dual rulership. Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. These are our faith and idea and larger than ourselves area of the chart. It's in the last quarter of the chart. It's the two last mutable signs. So Jupiter has this way of kind of, in a sense, not unlike, well, a little bit like his brother Hermes. This is Zeus, of course. He can be a bit of a trickster himself. I mean, when you see that he's ruling Sagittarius and Pisces, Sagittarius and Pisces, I think, are two of the major shapeshifters of the zodiac. Of course, Gemini and Virgo being the other ones. But Sagittarius and Pisces, they just have a way of kind of like blending in. Sagittarius wants to get along with everyone, wants to have a great time until it gets, hoof and mouth disease, because its ideas are so great and fantastic that it you know, falls all over itself to impress other people. Sag rising here, by the way. And Pisces, you know, just wants to really see the whole inclusive picture, wants to understand and deeply does understand that that we are all one, that that the oneness, the belief structure of the Piscean age, of course, is this idea of oneness. Of course, the belief is the idea that you have to go by way of martyrdom, but hopefully as we travel into the Aquarian age, we begin to let go of that ideal. And of course, Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. So we have fire and water for Jupiter, and we have earth and air for Saturn. Saturn in Capricorn gives us that ability, that foundation that we need. It's that part that knows that we have to, you know, do well in school, and then we have to go and get our bachelor's degree, and then we have to go get our master's degree, and then we have to go and get our PhD, and then we're going to be, you know, we have our master's and our PhD, and then we can actually be someone in the world, and we want to have, you know, seek importance and status and be something. And Aquarius, you know, really just wants to be able to take its ideas about everything it has, go up to its ivory tower and just look down on everyone else, you know, kind of tell them that they're wrong. But Saturn, you know, in these places, you know, Saturn plays this very, you know, realistic role in the traditional sense for Aquarius. A lot of people don't like to consider the modern and, I mean, the traditional rulers with the modern rulers, but I actually don't think, you know, if you look at, you know, Pisces, for instance, with Jupiter and Neptune, if you don't see the Jupiterian side of the Piscean nature, then you're not really going to understand the Piscean side of, I mean, the deeper Neptunian side of Pisces. And for Aquarius, what I like to say is that, you know, without that deep, strong foundation, the foundation of good logic and good thought process and good structuring of the mind, it doesn't really have a safe landing space to really bring those Uranian ideas in. I mean, when you're getting shocked with lightning all the time, you kind of need to make sure that you have a grounding rod to be able to accept that energy. That's why you can end up getting, you know, so many Aquarians that are, you know, kind of a rebel without a clue, because they're ungrounded in their response to what's going on. I'm an Aquarian here, by the way, so I'm not wanting to say anything bad about Aquarians. Aquarian sun. So Jupiter, or Zeus, is the son of Saturn in the ancient world. Here are the two of them in the Capricorn business office, you know, talking business, trying to figure out what the right thing is to do. Zeus was Zeus, just like his father. You know, it's an interesting play on the two of them, because Saturn was the stone that Rhea fed to Uranus that made him throw up, just like what happened with Jupiter and Saturn. With Saturn, Jupiter and Saturn. So there was this thing of, you know, the prophecy saying that their son was going to overthrow them. And so each one of them really kind of set forth their own way. They said, you know, we're not really limited by, you know, Mercury's playfulness and Venus's lovemaking all the time and Mars's lovemaking all the time. You know, they're a little further out there in the expanse of the orbits away from the sun. They have to consider things on a larger idea. So they have to come up with releasing that which has come before with a greater understanding of what needs to come after. So they are, in the traditional sense, called the great accordion, the inhale and the exhale. They have a cycle together of 11 to 13 years. They are the final two planets in the ancient world, and the only two planets the naked eye can see. Of course, a couple of years ago, we were lucky enough, Uranus came in a little closer, we were able to see it. But, you know, these were really, I mean, that's the reason why I started the talk with calling them the big daddies. They were the big, you know, the big planetary bodies that really kind of held place for our beingness through the ancient world up until Uranus was found in 1846, 1700s, I believe. Sorry. And so interesting facts about Jupiter-Saturn union. Here they're now in Aquarius, where they will be moving to in December. They're known as the great chronometer. You know, it's the timekeepers. You know, the cycles are so large for these two. It's a 12-year cycle for Jupiter to go around orbiting the sun. Saturn takes, you know, 29 to 30 years, depending. So, you know, these are, you know, larger cycles in our lives. These are, when these reunions happen in our birth chart, these are new stages, stages that get to finish, and new stages that really are, you know, pretty significant cycles in our lives. And with the two of them, every 40th conjunction, which is about some 800 years, they return to the starting place within 1 degree. It's also called the Great Mutation Cycle. And what we're moving to in December is a period of time, because it's every 400 years, every 200 years in each element. So what we're going to be moving to is the pair being in air in December. So they've been in Earth since 1842, and we're beginning what's called a new trigonalis cycle in air starting December 20th. So, you know, I think this is going to be a major time and change of us. You know, a lot of us, we're starting to see little pictures of this. You know, a lot of us are working home. We're doing this Zoom meeting. We're, you know, meeting with people across the world. A lot of us have been doing this for a few years, of course, but we're going to be doing more and more people around the world. Zoom stock just went like crazy. The amount of users went up some astronomical numbers since the coronavirus has happened. I mean, we're already seeing elements of this occurring. The other thing I want to say is that for Aquarius, this is actually the traditional ruler, which is Saturn, with the esoteric ruler, which is Jupiter. So it's another very significant time. This is a really wonderful opportunity for us to hopefully, you know, bring in higher ideals, a little more higher sense of self, greater ideas, and understanding that we have to create a structure that is going to support all of us. I mean, this could be, you know, social democracy, you know, something that actually helps us to understand that, you know, as we become more automated, as there are less people who are actually doing work in jobs and places, we're going to have to find ways to make sure that they're paid and taken care of. So I think, yeah, so I call this a breath of fresh air from earth to air. And yeah, this is the other thing I almost forgot. You know, 2,000 years ago, 3 magi were looking for someone in the desert, you know, because what was going on at that time was a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. Mars was there as well, which of course is going to add an amazing flair to the sense of color in the sky. But, and by the way, magi is another word for kings or astrologers, in case you didn't know. And that's my talk. Any questions, Erin?
Actually, I just wanted to make a comment to talk about what you were saying is that, you know, Kronos ate every one of his children as they were birthed. And then Rhea, his wife, got pretty fed up with this. And so she decided that she would then serve, rather than give her child, she put a big stone in a swaddling and gave Saturn the stone, which he then swallowed. And she spirited Jupiter, or Zeus, off to this cave where he was raised by wild women who are all like really, you know, like dancing and fermenting and, you know, pontificating and being really wild. And so when I think in terms of Saturn and Jupiter and the parental relationship that they have, it really is it's actually really a difficult relationship. But we think in terms of Jupiter-Saturn cycles as being really productive, because when Jupiter does conjoin with Saturn in its, you know, sort of 16-year period of time of transit around and making a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is one of the best times to get something really brought to birth. So, I mean, your story is great. It talks, and here it's ending, you know, with the birth of the Magi coming to see the Christ as he is being birthed, and so I think that's really an important part of the whole Jupiter-Saturn thing, is their father-son relationship, which never was great in mythology. It was never, they were always at it, you know, in some way or another. But yeah, thank you. That was really, really interesting.
And Jesus ended up getting martyred, right? So I mean, his story wasn't really any better. So.
Well, exactly. That's the thing. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. If you get crucified or crusade, whatever, it's all the same crucible that we're in.
All right. Thanks, Michael. That was really nice. Um, Hello, everybody, and my name is Marie O'Neill. I am an evolutionary astrologer and also an esoteric astrologer. When I looked at the various pairs that Erin put together, for me, all of them spoke because I believe that they're all, of course, important. Now, I had not looked at the concept of planets in pairs. And it was fascinating to actually go through the research and look at them that way. So for me, one of the planets that really calls to me or called to me this time was Pluto. And that also meant Mars. Now, a lot of people look at Pluto and Mars and they want to run the other direction. Yes, I wanted to run too, but I couldn't run. With Pluto, Pluto is the god of the underworld. We know this. Pluto is one of the Olympians. He is Jupiter's brother. He is, you know, he was given domain over the underworld. For those of us who are astrologers, we look at the meaning of Pluto and its orbit, and of course, how it's operating in the charts that we look at. So Pluto takes anywhere from 243 to about 248 years to orbit the sun. When Pluto got to, and it's also a generational planet. So wherever your Pluto is in the chart, whether it's Cancer or Virgo or Scorpio, it's about you, but it's also about your generation. It's asking you to, it's a collective planet for the generation. So because Pluto's orbit is elliptical, it goes, it spends about half of its time moving faster and half of its time moving slower. So for example, when Pluto got to Virgo, it started to speed up and it spends, I believe it's about 15 to 20 years in a sign. So now Pluto is in Capricorn and it's still going a little bit faster, but it's slowing down. So when it hits Aquarius, it won't be going as fast as it was in Capricorn. Pluto rules the subconscious, really. I see Pluto as the wound, as the soul wound. So wherever it is in the chart, I look at it as, okay, there's obviously some psychological work that needs to be done in this particular area for the individual, but it's also psychological work for the group, for the group that you are born into. When I look at Mars, Mars is, of course, the god of war. And I see Mars as a trigger for Pluto because it's one of the inner planets. And of course, with Pluto, Pluto is an outer planet discovered in the early 1930s. And if you recall, when Pluto was discovered, was around the time we started to have psychotherapy. We had the Jungian schools very active, and people started to want to delve into their subconscious. So I find it fascinating too that planets are discovered. And when planets are discovered, we see a correlation here on the Earth plane of what we're dealing with as the collective. Going back to Mars, Mars is a mental planet. Mars and Pluto together work wonderfully because they both rule Scorpio. When I say Mars is a mental planet, Mars, if it doesn't want to get itself into trouble, it needs to think before it acts. And Mars tends not to. It comes along and its job is, of course, to trigger. So whether Mars is transiting a house or making an aspect with a particular a particular planet, another planet and sign, its job is to trigger. And this is where, when I look at the two of them together, Mars might come along and trigger insight, Plutonian insight with the person. For example, let's look at this. Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008. And we look at the orbit of Mars and what its job was. We ended up having a breakdown of the financial system, of the housing market fell apart, and all of that was, Pluto was there, but Mars came along with its aspects and helped to trigger that. And of course, we were supposed to do the deep dive into ourselves to figure out what wasn't working, how we wanted to change things. We needed to do the deep psychological work. That is what Pluto asks of us. Remember, Pluto also rules sewers. It rules, because it's the underworld, and it also rules the treasures, all treasures, diamonds, anything gold, anything that is mined is ruled by Pluto. So if we are to thrive in the world and also thrive in our life or in our lives, we must do the Pluto work. We can avoid it for only so long. Because remember, Pluto is also transformation. So Pluto, you've got two ways to transform with Pluto. There's only two. You can delve in and do the deep dive yourself. As soon as you're triggered with something, you can dive and do the deep work and you can transform. Or you can choose not to, because we all have free will. And if we choose not to delve into and do the deep dive, then what we end up having is a breakdown before we get the breakthrough. But we will get the breakthrough. But if we choose to have a breakdown, that means that we end up suffering with depression, with anxiety, with a lot of fear. We end up just feeling sometimes worthless and annihilated. All of that is a part of Pluto's plan, because we are to get the breakthrough. So remember, with anything that we're dealing with, we get, you hit rock bottom sometimes. And wherever your bottom is, Pluto is still there. And Pluto will help you to pull yourself back up. And so will Mars. Like I said, Mars and Pluto work hand in hand, in my opinion. And I love them. I love to hate them. Can't get away from them. And right now, what we're dealing with, and think about this too, with Pluto in Capricorn, it's fascinating what we're going through now with Pluto, because, one of the other pairs that we've been talking about, or that Michael so eloquently talked about, was Saturn and Jupiter coming through and what they mean. So, but we had Pluto in Capricorn first. Why? We had Pluto there to help us to dig deep so that we can see our shadow, because Pluto is definitely going to show us our shadow. If we want to see it directly, that's fine. But if we don't want to see it, That's fine too. But eventually we will have to look at it. But Pluto was there first to jackhammer is the word that comes to mind. It jackhammers into us. And, so we've got debris going everywhere. And then Saturn comes along and says, "Oh, okay, let's structure. Let's do the work. Let's restructure. Let's figure out what it is you want." And then Jupiter, of course, is going to expand whatever is there. So I think it's no coincidence. Nothing is coincidence, as a matter of fact, that we have Pluto going through Capricorn, and it's going to be there until 2024. We also have Mars getting ready to go retrograde in Pisces, because what's the goal? What's the ultimate goal? The goal is to increase our consciousness, to elevate our consciousness, to evolve our consciousness. So this is what all of the planets are doing together. They're working in sync. But with Pluto, most people want to avoid Pluto. And I say, go towards Pluto, because that is going to help you and help all of us to elevate our consciousness, to come up with the systems and the tools and with everything that we need to evolve. So that is my talk on Pluto. I know I didn't spend as much time on Mars, but I see Mars as pivotal. We cannot do anything without Mars. Mars is action. If you want to clean your room, if you want to go on a trip, whatever it is you want to do, you have to have Mars to trigger you. And so it rules Scorpio. So with Mars is going to give you the courage that you need to do the Plutonian work, or any work for that matter, whether it be Venusian work or Saturn work or any of it. Mars is key, and so is Pluto. So please don't be afraid of Pluto, because my thing is make friends with Pluto, start talking to Pluto. I know it might be difficult at first, but Pluto is not the enemy. Pluto's actually here to help us. And remember this, Pluto does not care whether you want to transform or not. You will transform. Pluto does not care whether you die. As a matter of fact, Saturn is that gatekeeper, so you die. Pluto says, come see me after you're dead. I'll help you. So that's my talk. Erin.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a Mars, Saturn, Pluto conjunction in my natal chart, squared by Sun and Scorpio. So I'm pretty familiar with the energies involved in those planets. And the thing that's most interesting about what you were talking is the displacement of the outer planets as they were sighted of inner planets, and thereby fulfilling a whole different zodiac. Like, for example, when you talk about Pluto, Pluto, is definitely a ruler of Scorpio, but it used to be Mars. Mm-hmm. And Mars ruled Aries and Scorpio. So Pluto then usurped. But Pluto is also known as the guardian of the wealth of the earth, of everything, all of our resources.
Yep.
Which is why it's so important that we pay attention to the resources like water and food and people, human beings, mm-hmm. Of cultures. It's so very important that we do that, because that's part of what Pluto is about. Is about killing off anything that isn't working, but also it's related to Mars because when it was sighted, it usurped part of Mars's mm-hmm. role. Mm-hmm. It's like when Uranus was sighted, it took over the rulership of Aquarius, which meant that Saturn was only ruling Capricorn. Mm-hmm. And when Neptune was sighted, it took over the role the house Jupiter rules, Sagittarius. And so we had Neptune, in the 12th house, ruling the 12th house, which was Pisces. And so now what you're saying is that basically that with Mars and Pluto, we've got father and son working together, to try and, either re-heal and make the world a better place, or to, destroy it. So there's always that destructive part of it, isn't there? When we have to deal with.
And
Yeah.
what people don't realize about Pluto is Pluto really doesn't care whether you die.
No, no. In fact, Pluto is the one who nurses and nurtures the dead. I mean, the underworld isn't hell. It's not the Christian hell.
Right.
It's a very social place. There's a lot of people there. They're all hanging out. They're waiting for reincarnation. They don't know when it's going to be or where they're going to go. And Hermes, of course, being the psychopomus, is carrying the people into Hades. And Hades, Pluto, looks after them. And then he ends up with a consort, Penelope, who's there half the time. And so he's really having this wonderful life, actually, in the underworld, looking after all these people, all the shades. So he really looks after us after we're gone, essentially. Yeah.
He's not a bad guy, even though, so many people see him as bad, but he's not.
Not necessarily. No, I've seen some political transits. I spent, with all my planets in Scorpio and Leo, I spent 10 years with Pluto going over my ascendant Sun and Mercury and squaring Mars, Saturn, Pluto, and Leo. In 10 years, I wrote 7 books. I had 3 people on me die on me, which was horrible. However, so it does have something to do with loss. Yeah. So what you were talking about with, divesting ourselves of our ego through Pluto transit, for example, is a loss. It's a loss of identity, a certain identity. So what do you think?
Well, I agree. And of course, coming from the Buddhist perspective, we embrace the death of what no longer works, what no longer serves.
Yeah.
And And also, of course, the way I look at it too is that Pluto, it's about attachment. So we can have pain. All of us are going to have pain, but that doesn't mean that we have to suffer. Pain and suffering is the attachment to the pain. And so Pluto is going to bring the pain because there's something that we need to let go of so that we can gain.
That's interesting because, Pluto and Neptune, or Poseidon and Zeus, they all had to draw straws for rulership. It just happened. So it's Neptune, Poseidon, and Pluto, Hades, and Zeus. They had to decide which rulership they would take. It just happened that Hades drew the short straw and ended up in the looking after the underworld, whereas Poseidon looks after the sea, and Zeus looks after the sky. So between the 3 of them, they had to make a decision. And so the only way they did it was through drawing straws, and it's on sheer luck that it's Pluto that's in the underworld.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that you say that because, Neptune is the planet of spirituality. And it's, for me, I know the placement of Neptune in the sky and Pluto and all that, but it feels as though you have to do the Pluto work to get to Neptune, because Neptune is where you find enlightenment, where you find your bliss, spiritual bliss. But you've got to do that Pluto work to raise the consciousness of Neptune. As a matter of fact, you have to do the Pluto work to raise the consciousness of all of the other planets in your chart too. They don't work. Their consciousness or how they function in your life is direct correlation between how much inner work you're actually doing.
Well,
And
yeah,
how
when you
Pluto works.
consider that Pluto is down there in the underworld, looking after all the shades and the people who are waiting for reincarnation. I mean, that's a pretty graceful place to be. But the fact is that, you know, his as transit, for example, it went 12 years in Scorpio,
Yeah.
and because it's elongating now in its orbit, it'll spend 32 years in Taurus.
That's
So
right.
we might all be grateful, or we might reincarnate into where we have to have 4 planets in Taurus in our natal chart and Pluto transiting them for 32 years. I don't think so. I would not want that. I would not choose
Well, you think
that.
about it now, we've got what, we have the possibility of having Pluto oppositions now because of the orbit of Pluto. So those born with Pluto in Virgo will more than likely live long enough to have the Pluto oppose Pluto.
From
So,
Pisces,
it's possible.
be pretty old.
Yeah, but it's possible.
Well, the United States is having a Pluto opposition right now to its sun, and the fact that it was, you know, that's what's happening within the United States. You can affect whole countries.
Well, yeah, we're having our Pluto return.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we have so much stuff coming up now. And I see Pluto, I see what we're going through now with the returns. I see it as a report card. So to me, when we got into the orb of the Pluto return, we started to have foreshadowing of what our Pluto return was going to be like. So it's telling us how we've done over the past 240 years or so, and what we need to clean up.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess that's part of what this pandemic is about. Is that, you know, we're throwing off a lot of extraneous and unnecessary objects, including people, and all sorts of stuff that have to be just literally wiped off the face of the earth in order for the earth to survive. For the earth to survive, it is about a survival issue. Whenever you have a Pluto transit, it's about survival.
It is. And,
Yeah.
you know, we're moving into the Aquarian age, and we don't want to take the negative, or we don't want to take these issues into the Aquarian age. We would like to, it's better if we can resolve them, you know, in this transition period, because whatever we don't resolve will go into that age, and that affects the Aquarian age and what it's all about, what it's supposed to be about as a whole. So, I mean, we're being asked to do the Pluto work, and we know what that work is because it's right in front of us. I mean, we're getting a report card actually comes in 2022 for this country, but every country has Pluto in Capricorn somewhere in its chart.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it definitely is a time of deep cleansing, which is what Pluto does in a transit to a natal chart. So whatever it's transiting in your chart right now, needed to be completely and utterly destroyed in order to be reformed. So it's about reformation. I mean, Pluto is there to guard the shades, to look after people in transition.
Yeah. And I know that in Buddhism, we call it polishing the diamond. So diamond, you know, we've got this diamond that Pluto also has in the underworld. That's where we go to get it. So Pluto is helping us to polish ourselves, to polish the diamond, to keep washing the dirt off the diamond so that we can have our treasure. Because lots of treasure. Oops, there goes the bell.
Sorry about that, Marie. David Green is here. So, Dava, please go ahead. Unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Hi, Deva.
Hi, Erin.
How are you doing?
You.
Good, thank you. Wanted to thank everybody so much for the time and space. It's great to be here with you all today.
Thank you.
So I was thinking that we could talk a little bit about the relationship between Mars and Pluto. And my main emphasis between speaking on those particular planets in terms of their relationship or as a planetary pair is essentially how Mars operates as the conscious expression of the desires emanating from Pluto. I think that it can be so often we can hear the words, but we often forget that Pluto is typically unconscious, that when we speak of Pluto, it's the process of becoming conscious through different experiences, be them cataclysmic or non-cataclysmic, just the process of life, that we progressively become conscious of the deeper patterns that are embedded within our soul. Again, in the typical majority of folks, 80% of their desire, 80% of their behavior, if I remember correctly, is unconscious. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that from my understanding, part of going into the underworld is also retrieving, is that we're going into the underworld so that we can bring up into light patterns that have been stored in the unconscious so that we can then metamorphose, so that we can grow and unfold in the new awareness and into a new understanding of our deeper patterns. And then when we look at Mars, we're looking at how those, the dual desire nature within the soul, one to separate, one to return, is consciously acted upon. It's the desires that we can put our finger on and say, oh yeah, I can definitely feel, or I can definitely identify in a very conscious way that my Mars is in the 5th or that my Mars is in the 4th. And we may have a harder time putting our finger on the more deeper patterns that are in Pluto. We can sure feel them. And when we tune into them and when we settle, we can sure then say, oh yes, so that's Pluto. So I may have Mars in this sign, but my Pluto, my soul, when I tune into it, when I become conscious, is actually here. So the main point that I'd like to focus on in terms of the relationship is that even though at times we can think, or that we can again consciously put our finger on Mars as being the leading edge of evolution, what's always pulling us forward, giving our birth chart constant motion, that those desires are actually emanating from Pluto, from the soul themselves. And I think so often we can be outside of that, or we can be, let's take the symbol of the wave upon the sea. If my consciousness is centered in upon the individual wave, then I identify as myself with a separate entity. Versus if my consciousness is centered within the sea or within the ocean, that I can see that I'm an individual wave, but that I'm not a separate entity. I'm only an individual wave upon the universal sea, so to speak. So at least from my understanding, this is very important because we can all have a myriad of desires that are emanating from Pluto. And then via the function of Mars, we can give those action ad infinitum. And from my understanding, in the spirit of constant motion, or in the spirit of Mars putting something into being, so to speak, or putting motion behind things, taking action, we can either experience accelerated growth when we are merging with a higher will, when we're acting upon desires that, as you were sharing, would create to regeneration, that from my understanding are almost like a shedding of older desires too, or shedding of desires that are a reflection of the past rather than are a reflection of a new cycle, a new direction, and putting a lot of willpower around acting upon that new direction that the soul can sense it's ready for. It's maybe a Mars-Pluto transit more, but the essential point is that we can either accelerate or decelerate at the exact same momentum. And so from my understanding, it's so important to see the relationship between Pluto and Mars, because we can all put our foot on the accelerator, but where are we going? Are we going 100 miles per hour in the wrong backwards, or are we going 100 miles per hour in a direction that will allow us to discover a new direction? Let's say, for example, looking at what's happening now, it's when things went very violent, and there was thankfully there was a quick correction. Putting willpower behind things that are regenerative, that can restore, that can bring up desires that can create stagnation and limitation. Mars is certainly speed. Can be, again, moving down the highway in 100 miles per hour. But when we link it with Pluto, we're really seeing how what we're putting into motion are desires that are emanating from what's typically unconscious. And so it's through that action, or it's through that motion, self-discovery, that we can progressively become more aware of the nature of our desires, and which desires allow us to experience more freedom, which desires truly allow a new cycle to begin, whether it's breaking free from an old habit of fear, whether it's the courage to act upon speaking the truth in ways. Let's say you have Mars in the 9th, and that's been a dynamic of fear, to be able to put into motion actions to where you speak truth in very uncomfortable situations. But a new cycle relative to Pluto Mars, you put action around it. You start speaking about natural laws, things that are intrinsically true. This could also bring up fear in regards to past religious conditioning. Maybe it's an uncomfortable situation to speak about things because they contrast with an older paradigm or an older conditioning. But Pluto Mars, breaking through, putting into motion actions to where we can experience a deeper dimension of ourselves, and to where we can put into motion patterns that can allow us to regenerate and to bring knowledge that was retrieved from the underworld to the surface.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I brought me back, Deva. Thank you for speaking so clearly and cogently and deeply on Pluto and Mars, because I had, like I said, a 10-year transit of Pluto to my Mars, Saturn, Pluto, and Leo, over my ascendant and sun. And oh, it was incredible. And people died, and a lot within me died, but a lot was born. So the fact, what you're talking about, as far as being able to access areas of the unconscious that are so remote and so inescapable, though, in our behaviors, without us actually realizing that it's being demanded, if you will, from some other power that be. It often is Pluto who comes in from some sort of almost like meta-historical place in our psyche, where it's lodged itself, and it's actually holds the entire value and beauty and all of the riches and the wealth of the earth. And so it might be at this stage, as it's passed through Scorpio, now in Capricorn, it's actually looking at the structure of things and saying, this is going to go. We have to break the chain. We've got to come to consciousness about what it is that we are ignoring, have ignored, taken for granted, and so on. And I think everybody's feeling that in their own personal way. But it's really happening collectively, because we are now forced, literally, to isolate and to, and to mask ourselves when we see people, and go into, I went and got a new battery in my tire my tire fixed. And, you know, everybody's like wearing masks and everybody's nodding and grinning, you know, you can tell because you just know. And my daughter is taken to as a dental hygienist, and of course doesn't work right now because that's one of the more dangerous jobs to do. She's taken to making masks. And so, I mean, it can be really creative. It's like, okay, so we might die of all of this, but at least I'm going to make something beautiful in order to be able to, cover my face. I wish I had it with me, but I have it in my bag and it's not here. But I tell you, there are creative things can come out of some of the most drastic situations. I mean, when I wrote my books, as I said, I was under a Pluto transit. I had to do it. It came out of what appeared to be just my soul. And so it has to do with the soul and the soul's capacity to regenerate and to renew and to bring to the world a much better thing in the long run. And we may be looking at a long run at this stage right now. Yeah, so I really appreciate what you were saying, Dave, right now.
Yeah, right, exactly. And from my perspective too, like what you were saying, how creativity can come from the most drastic places, and it's almost in a place of, for me personally, it almost feels like this energy of being a first responder in these really comical situations. It can seem so mundane, but all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, like we need to attend to this right now. And we end up making these things that are just incredible. I mean, I know that working with children and families, that all of a sudden through this came this incredible desire of energy for families and children to communicate how important the community was, putting up all these pictures of themselves, and created just this incredible collage of how much the community meant, and what can we give to each other right now. And honestly, I'd never experienced anything like it. And with the Mars Pluto energy, it was almost like a reflection on how to use will. I mean, it came very strongly a lesson of where to put that raw energy that Pluto can bring up. And when you see this through this the immediacy to respond, and as you were sharing what can come through that, it's really a wonder.
It's so true what you're saying. I mean, my hair is on end. The fact that, that Pluto, it rules death, but it also rules the rebirthing of things. So that, like you say, you can create a community out of something that could threaten your life.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're doing right now. With the COVID-19, is that we are creating a community that, because we could be killed by the environment. And the environment is part of Pluto's domain, because not only is he ruler of the underworld, but he's also a god that actually does have a lot to do with the atmosphere. Okay, so the atmosphere is what's been really been threatened, and so that people can't even breathe the air in the same way that they used to. And so that's where I think that the positive side of Pluto comes up in things like you're creating a community with people, so that kids can play with each other and they get to know their families, and families and communities grow together. And that was what was happening with me during my 10 to 12 year Pluto transit over personal planets, squaring and conjoining, was that I had to recreate myself, even in the face of holding people as they died. Friends of mine who were dying of AIDS, because that was the pandemic that we went through 50 years ago. It was 45 years ago was the AIDS pandemic. And it was killing people off like crazy. But it also brought people together. And so what this is doing, this Pluto transit, it is bringing people into a space where they have to start thinking differently.
Right, exactly. And with the Capricorn energy too, potentially we can, oh, I'm sorry, did I run out of time?
No, no,
Oh,
no.
we can recreate, or we can bring back a paradigm that, from my understanding relative to collective consciousness, and Pluto and Saturn was in Capricorn, now in Aquarius, that we can go back to a paradigm that's intrinsically in our consciousness. Or I mean, Saturn can also be bones. It's like something that we
Yeah,
all remember. We all remember being structured in this way, and it can come back in a new way. It will never be the way that it was, in terms of, wanting to make sure I don't come across as go back to the past, but that we can retrieve it in such a way to where we rebuild exactly that in a way that's appropriate for the times. And that with Saturn, it's becoming such a responsibility for us all, that all of us have a feeling, I would say, not to speak for everybody, but we're all progressively becoming aware of areas where we can be responsible for change, or where we can collectively contribute to formulating a structure that really helps us all regenerate personally and collectively. And that paradigm is something that comes from the past. Or with Capricorn, is something that is intrinsically within us, or it's a memory, and can be structured. And it's trying to find this roadmap around how it will work now. um,
well, that certainly is true, because I mean, Saturn was the one who devoured his children until his mother decided she was fed up with that. His wife, I should say, and so when you think in terms of Saturn as the devourer and Pluto as the sort of death threat, we think, what are we supposed to do with these planets, doing Pluto in Capricorn? And what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to be forced into sitting with ourselves, facing our unconscious, bringing it to the conscious mind, working with it in a way that we're going to be able to improve or better our own personal self, in that way improving the collective by that tiny little bit. Just as long as one person can do the work, then it improves the collective. And I think that's what the Pluto-Mars conjunction, sort of conjunction in the light of what you were talking about, Deva, I think that is what it's about. It's about forcing us into really revamping our entire value system. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. So I agree with you totally.
Okay, thank you, Deva and Erin. So let's move now to Bradley Narragan.
Hello, how's it going? Thanks, Deva and Erin and everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Unity and Duality. That is a very interesting title.
Yes, thank you.
I started writing and I thought, wait a minute, what does unity and duality mean?
Yeah.
What does this talk about? Definition of unity, the state of being united or joined as a whole. Duality, the quality or condition of being dual. Dual, consisting of two parts, elements or aspects. So we're here today asking ourselves, how can two separate parts of self be united? And I'm gonna, thankfully, maybe I'm on a sun moon here, a different topic. For a healthy sun, you will need a healthy moon. When we study the relationship between the sun and the moon, keep in mind that Cancer precedes Leo. The sun ruling Leo and the moon ruling Cancer, of course. How and what one creates, our energetic quality, the way we step into our own self-expression and life purpose, sun, is directly linked to the self-identity, one's level of emotional security, and the ways one has developed, moon. In the hardest of times, we turn to various channels of creative expression because there's no other way to restore balance and unity of being. Our sun and moon parts of self are so foundational to being. They represent our individual culture. By existing, we have an ego. By the fact we exist, we express and create. The phrase egocentric self-expression captures this duo of the solar and lunar parts of us. This
Right.
phrase also suggests one's natural expression emerges from the ego. Ego precedes expression. I'd argue that every moment in life we're creating, we just need to expand our definition of creating. Because a lot of people perhaps are not conscious of what they are creating, they don't see that they are creating, or people do not see what they're creating as valuable, or we've fallen into a cultural definition of creating, and we're comparing and contrasting ourselves to all the ways we're not creating like creative people do. But anyway, ultimately, our potential to create and manifest, sun, connects to our self-image, moon, egocentric self-expression. This is what this duo is about. One, we turn to forms of expression to move energy and emotion, restoring unity and wholeness of being. Trapped and fully contained water stagnates, resulting in all sorts of harmful bacteria and parasites. Like stagnant water, held emotions lead to all sorts of emotional dis-ease and health issues. We know this. In the big picture of one's life, the journey into unity of being is of course different and unique for each of us. To come to a place of unity between our self-image and self-expression, we first need to consider the phase our sun and moon are in. Then of course, we go further with their house sign, precise degrees of separation and aspects to other bodies and points in the chart. By the way, in evolutionary astrology, as taught by Jeffrey Wolf Green, we start with phase first, then we go into aspect, which is what I'm doing here, like house first, and then going into sign. So for those born with the new phase of the lunation cycle, this process of egocentric self-expression will be in a process of discovery. Perhaps you don't know the form of expression you identify with. You have yet to be discovering it. You can accept that as natural to you. You're gonna need freedom and space to try on different creative forms, discovering what fits for you and feels right as these emerge over time. If we find the sun and moon are in the crescent phase, you're learning to become established in the forms of self-expression that you're drawn to really own your own unique form of creative self-expression. You will need to continue to put forth effort. Continuing to put forth effort to cultivate these forms will create unity between your expression of self and image of self. When the moon and sun have reached the first quarter phase, we have this classic crisis in action. What form of self-expression will you choose that reflects who you are, that embodies your self-image? The closer to the actual first quarter square, the more we see key moments in life where in crises you reorient and choose a new creative path to realign your purpose with your identity. When the moon and sun are in gibbous phase, you find yourself in this constant process of self-analysis. Does my own creative expression actually reflect who I am? Does it serve a purpose and help? To attain and maintain unity between the moon and sun, you simply need to embrace that your life is a process of refinement of egocentric self-expression. When you reorient to seeing your life through this lens, you can accept and grow with the process, as humbling as it may be at times. When the sun and the moon are in their full phase, your experience of self-image and self-expression are indeed opposite parts of self. Opposing forces you're learning to find a balance between. There is a need to share what you create. There's also a need to learn to find balance between the energy going out and being receptive to others. When you begin to identify with giving and receiving in an equal way, unity exists with this opposing duo. If the sun and moon are in the disseminating phase, you naturally identify with and embody, the capacity to bring your creative self into your roles and positions within society. As you mature into bringing your own forms of egocentric self-expression into society in some capacity, you find unity between your creative self and self-image. When the sun and the moon are in that last quarter phase, again, we're at another crisis of egocentric self-expression. Of course, the classic crisis in consciousness. In this scenario,
Right.
as the inherited limits of the familial, social, and cultural ways are being realized, we seek to identify beyond these, to restore unity between the solar and lunar you, embrace and nurture your own journey to re-image yourself, connecting with the journey of self-manifestation beyond society's conceptions, wherever that may take you. When the moon and sun are in the balsamic phase, you're screwed. No, just kidding. In this phase,
Not really.
your ego needs to identify with self-expressions and purpose that transcend the present place and time, connecting you with something much greater than the ego self. When you're struggling to find unity between your life purpose and your identity, you're going to go inward and embrace that momentum. It's going to lead to connection with the spiritualized aspects of your purpose and egocentric self-expression. Let's consider for a moment the metaphor of a plant representing a human life. A plant grows. Its growth reflects the nutrients present in the soil, the amount of water and sunlight it receives, and its relationship with all the other organisms in the environment. My partner is often bringing home plants from the store that no one else is going to buy. And for whatever reason, they got dehydrated or broken, or they were partially eaten or overgrown, or maybe they became root bound. Typically for an annual, they never really fully bounce back. There's limited time in a season, as there is in a lifetime. People are a lot like plants. So many of us don't realize our full creative self-expression and potential due to lack of care, love, support, nourishment, and safety, being ourselves in the world. These are moon problems that create sun problems. To me, I see we need to keep on raising collective awareness of our society's moon problems. We have these institutions that were built on greed and racism and oppression, and they've created unsafe environments. Lack of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual nourishment is provided to we the people. Too many people are experiencing the opposite of a safe, a secure, supportive, and nurturing society. If you get to experience society in the USA in this way, that's probably the privilege of being white. For a healthy sun, we need a healthy moon. For healthy leaders, we need the people to be healthy. True social security and equality. Protect and nurture the people. And that's the extent of my message today on the sun moon, and curious what some of your thoughts are on that, Erin.
Oh, thanks. A lot of thoughts. First, I mean, it really got me thinking, because the very first astrology book that I read was called The Lunation Cycle by Damien Jar. That's how I got turned on. I mean, I knew something was out there, so I had to go and find it. But the other thing I wanted to say, it made me kind of laugh, is ego actually means in Latin, I am. That's all it means. But say, for instance, if I'm arrived to a party, I walk in the room, I go, ego sum, which means I am here. Yeah, so it really has been demoralized, if you will. It's been put into a position where we forget that ego itself, if we didn't have an I amness, we wouldn't be who we were. And so if we want to do something with our ego as it's pronounced in Latin, then we can say ego sum, I am here as a helper, I am here as a destroyer, I am here for various reasons. And so, I mean, when you were talking about the lunation cycle, it really just brought back a real history for me, which is beautiful, because the sun and the ego has to do with shining and passion, and the moon is really our deep, deep self, our unconscious, and the capacity to feel, not just think, to actually feel without being able to articulate it. And we also know that too, that the balsamic phase of the moon is actually ruled by Hecate, and she's one of the goddesses of the underworld, and it's the prophetic part of the phase of the moon, when everything has been brought into its fullness and then back into the darkness. Hecate rises up to predict what's going to come and try and perceive and interpret things as to what's going to happen. And I mean, I have a balsamic moon, so I have an obsession with knowing what's going to happen. I mean, as an astrologer, that would be normal, wouldn't this? I work a lot with transits, so I want to know what's going to be happening. This is what I do for people as my work, is to talk to them about where they're at, what's happening with them, and what's going on. And it's all very about, in a sense, kind of prophetic. So when you talk about the latter phase of the moon, the Hecate phase, the balsamic, it's prophetic. It has within it the entire experience, as you were saying. I mean, I'm validating what you're saying. I'm not giving my own lecture, but it does mean that you're able to see in the dark. And so this is part of what we're going through at this phase. We could almost say that we're in a balsamic phase as a collective in our consciousness in the world, and that we need to see in the dark. And I think that's part of what we're doing and what we're trying to learn within this remarkable, unprecedented, even though there have been plagues, but this is an unprecedented one. And it's time. It's time for Hecate to rise up and say, okay, this is what you're supposed to do.
I totally agree that we're in that, so-called dark moon time, and we can't see where we're going. And like we talked about earlier, we're in the balsamic Jupiter-Saturn phase right now, and in the United States, we're having our balsamic Pluto return. So we kind of have this double level of the breakdown, and we don't know where it's going.
Yeah.
But
Thank you. That's great, Bradley. That was really helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Christina, go ahead, please.
Okay, I will go. So speaking of the moon, well, first I'm going to share my screen. I can't talk and share my screen at the same time. It doesn't usually work, so hold on.
But I can see. Oh.
Yeah, let's see. Screen sharing.
I see a diamond and the liberation of civil consciousness.
Great, hold on. Zoom share, all right. So that's actually my last slide, so hang in there until we get home. You can see my slides before I give the presentation. That's pretty good. Okay, this is very Uranian. By the way, so my presentation, can everybody hear and see? Are you seeing one slide at a time, or are you seeing the whole thing?
Christina, your sound is a little bit...
It's weird.
Just try again.
No, I hear that. So you're hearing background noise?
That's better.
The roles of Saturn and Uranus.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if I should...
You'll need to go to full screen on the slides.
Oh, am I not on full screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just perhaps double click on the slide at the bottom, the number 1 slide there. Just see what happens if you...
Nope. I just switched
right
slides.
At the bottom.
So are you? So there's 2 issues. One, I'm hearing background noise all of a sudden, which I can just take off my headphones. Probably get rid of that. So, but you're actually seeing the whole slide presentation, not just one slide.
Yes.
Okay, that's not good. I can swap. That's all right. I'll swap displays. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
How's that?
That's
Beautiful.
it. Beautiful.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to take off my headphones because I'm hearing a lot of background noise all of a sudden. But, oh shoot. Are you guys hearing background noise?
No.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it because that means I have to get out of my screen sharing and I don't want to go through all that again. All right. Okay, so my moon is in Aquarius, speaking of the moon. So I really wanted to speak about the roles of Saturn and Uranus, and in particular around the liberation of solar consciousness. And talking about unity and duality, I see a real synastry here. Of course, I would with the moon in Aquarius being co-ruled by both Saturn and Uranus. I find them both very exciting in their own way. So, okay, so just a big picture view of the solar system, because this is very important, because the juxtaposition between Saturn and Uranus is significant. As we know, Saturn is at the outer edge of the visible planets. Of course, we've got the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then Jupiter, and then Saturn. Since ancient Babylonian times, humans knew about the planets Mercury through Saturn because they could see them. And so it was within their consciousness. And Michael, it wasn't, I actually can give you a date for when Uranus was discovered. So where do I have it here? It was discovered March 13th, 1781. And it was discovered because it was an astronomer who noticed a planet, or they just thought it was a star. I mean, you can actually see Uranus in the sky with the naked eye, but it looks like a star. When they developed the telescope, now I didn't write down the name of the person who discovered it, and I can't remember off the top of my head. Okay.
Excuse me, Christina.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether if you removed your headphones, whether the sound would be better.
Okay, will do. That means though, okay, hold on 1 second. Yeah, no problem. I'm going to switch to. Okay, can you hear me now?
That is much better. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I don't know what was happening with those headphones, but all right. So the juxtaposition between Saturn and Uranus. So Uranus was not really discovered until 1781. Herschel is the name of the guy. It was named by, they chose the name, and Erin, you know this, based on classical mythology, based on Uranus being considered the sky god, and or the god of the starry sky. And he also was the father of Saturn. So it made logical sense to name this new discovered planet Uranus, which we now call Uranus. And so at the juxtaposition between the two basically is Saturn is the last planet of the inner planets, and Uranus is the first planet of the outer, or what is oftentimes called by astrologers transpersonal planets. And so as we know, there's a significant demarcation between them, and I consider them very symbiotic, and I'm going to explain why. Beginning with Saturn, ruler of space, time, and karma. It is a contraction of the incarnation process in space-time, and so obviously it rules space-time. It also rules boundaries, the skin of our bodies on the physical plane, as well as psychological and mental boundaries. And of course, in evolutionary astrology, we connect a lot. We connect Saturn oftentimes with our conditioning patterns. And for those who are not aware, we consider the conditioning factors of the family that we were born into, whether the mother, the father, sibling, aunts, uncles, etc. It also includes our ancestors. The conditioning factors could also be the economic. Are we born poor, or were we born rich, or anywhere in between there? It affects our conditioning. It affects our consciousness as we're being raised. especially in the early years of our lives. What is the religious conditioning that we were raised into? Were our parents, was our family atheist or agnostic? Or, you know, were they Baptist or anywhere in between? It rules our social conditioning. What role did your parents play in society? How engaged were they in society or not? How engaged were they with their friends? Who were their friends? This all influences our conditioning as we are maturing as prior to adulthood, as well as political conditioning too. Can't forget that. So Saturn is what we're conscious of, and also that which gives us security, which has already been spoken of. To feel secure, we attempt to suppress what we are afraid of into the personal unconscious, which is actually Uranian territory. And here I'm speaking specifically of the personal unconscious. Saturn is the ruler of space and time and the consequences of our actions. So it rules karma as it gets played out through the cycles of time. And talking about cycles of time, Saturn works approximately, as you all know, our Saturn return every 29.5 years. And then with every quadrature period of time, 7 years in between, we are tested in that cycle. And the testing is the process of maturing from childhood into adulthood. And also the social maturation process as well. So what is needed with Saturn is to integrate, or what we are, you know, being asked to do is to integrate our sense of individual identity, our authority, and our purpose within the context of society. Okay. So Saturn is very important in the incarnational process, as is Uranus. So as Saturn contracts, Uranus awakens and liberates. As Saturn is ruled by Earth, Uranus is ruled by air. It is outside of time. Okay, and that's the piece that I find absolutely fascinating, that demarcation plane between Saturn and Uranus. It is outside of time, and so it allows one to see the bigger picture, oftentimes with a real quickness and charge to it, so that one feels super energized when you get the picture. It, as an air element, it rules the intellect, and yet it can act as the trickster that shifts thoughts to outside of the box. It brings in innovative thinking. It quickens the mind and brings sudden insights like, wow, I can't believe I just saw what I just saw. I saw the whole gestalt instantaneously. It also rules objectivity, detachment, brilliant intellectuality, openness, and the ability or availability to change. And as I said, it rules innovation, cutting edge, newness. As I mentioned, it rules long-term memory in evolutionary astrology. So that includes the individual unconscious past life memory, as well as the future blueprint of our future. And as we know, I do want to just say, you know, one qualification, the blueprint, as we know, is not static at all. The blueprint is in our DNA as a potential, and it's a potential that we have to work hard to activate, to ensure, you know, to focus our Mars energy to ensure that we do activate and manifest it. So it isn't something that we just automatically kind of fall into. However, there is a blueprint there, and Uranus rules the whole timeline of the past and the future in the individual timeline. Okay. So also Uranus is idealistic, clairvoyant, again, seeing the whole picture. And it also rules, you know, especially with Aquarius, it rules community and the tribe of our like-minded people and our friends. When you bring the two together, Uranus, it strikes through in order to liberate. It strikes through the Saturnian boundaries, that which has been suppressed into the personal unconscious. As Jeffrey Green says in his book, Uranus, Freedom from the Known, Uranus is always trying to knock on Saturn's door in such a way to shatter all conditioning patterns, all those known, familiar, and thus secure
structural definitions of inner and outer reality. So as we maneuver through the maturation process to become a contributing member in society, Saturn, and to have authority over our own lives, in other words, like to earn money, pay our bills, fit into and be accepted by society, or even just to survive, we inevitably suppress aspects of ourselves, which, as you know, is essentially suppressing our life force. But there comes a point where the pressure of emotional and mental suppression builds to a point that Uranus emerges with suddenness and crashes through from the unconscious. And again, this is the personal unconscious, as a rebel rebels in its desire for freedom. The individual suddenly feels that they must express their unique identity, even when they oftentimes don't even know what that is. It works, Uranus works by shattering cherished limitations of oneself and for those around them. It changes the environment. Since Uranus holds the personal past and the blueprint of one's future, it can also liberate the awareness of one's past lives or provide the freedom of seeing a larger future. But when Uranus hits, and depending how defended and contracted one's consciousness is to the unconscious material, it can emerge all disjointed and fragmented, unconnected. Again, it depends how strong the Saturnian walls are and in how defended and fearful we are of change. Because ultimately, as one becomes more conscious over time, the Uranian impulse, that lightning bolt that just crashes through and opens up the unconscious into conscious awareness, can release conditioning with absolute joy and with excitement and with anticipation of the something new that's about to happen. So Uranus is not intrinsically bad. It's not intrinsically scary. It's not intrinsically terrifying. It only is when our conditioning has gotten so locked and so stuck in fear and in defensiveness, it will be terrifying. But it can, as it does, provide a vision that is infused with hope and inspiration. When Uranus touches Saturn, it refuses to accept any limitations imposed by Saturn to the radiating power of the sun. Okay, according to Dane Ruggier, Uranus challenges most specifically Saturn and the sun. In other words, the circumference, Saturn, and the central source of energy that operates within the heliocosmic field, the sun. The personal fire of the sun, the Leo archetype of self, is ultimately liberated by the higher mental vibration of Uranus. It does this as Uranus cracks open the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious aspects of mind. And as we can allow a free flow of communication between the different aspects of mind, we are progressively individuating from the confines of time-space reality. This not only liberates us from the conditioned reality of dual consciousness, duality, Uranus opens us up into the impersonal collective mind and unity consciousness, which is ruled by Neptune, and Neptune ruling the collective unconscious as well. So, obviously this is not necessarily a linear process. As Uranus works, Neptune's working as well, and Pluto is working, the power of it, the evolutionary process itself. So there is, when I'm speaking about Uranus, I'm speaking about the personal conscious mind ruled by Saturn and the personal unconscious mind ruled by Uranus. So the symbiotic relationship between Uranus and Saturn, I'm using the image of the crystal here because to represent the symbiotic relationship between them. Now I can use, right here I'm using the diamond. I can use any crystal on planet Earth. Uranus is the light, and Saturn is the geometric form created by time and space that gives form a unique identity. In all crystals, light is transmitted through the structure formed by molecules. And here I'm giving an image of the diamond's structure of carbon atoms as they are tightly bound with each other. Each mineral has a unique structure that is created by the atoms' relationship to one another. We would not have the stunning beauty of a diamond or any crystal if we did not have the structure of Saturn, nor would we be able to see it without the light of Uranus, or the Uranian light. Another way to say this on a personal level, Saturn is forging a personal reality through focus and hard work and patience and with integrity, such that one creates a world that is strong enough to radiate our own divine nature. The liberation of solar consciousness to divine consciousness. So Uranus's role in liberating our consciousness to achieve diamond consciousness is precisely the shocking, surprising, liberating energy needed to upset Saturn's powers of defenses that are built through time, and to transform the sun's mode of operation so that it can be in a greater state of availability for divine consciousness. In other words, Neptune, to emerge and for evolution to occur. And as we know, Pluto rules evolution. I just want to, that's the end of my, hopefully 10-minute part of my presentation. The one thing I wanted to point out though, which I found interesting, and Michael, when you were talking about Jupiter, Saturn, it was like, oh, I decided to look this up because you had mentioned the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on December 20th, 2020. And it's like, oh, where is Uranus in this? And Uranus is actually, I think it was 7 degrees or 9 degrees. Oh, I'll show my face on this. Uranus then will be 6 degrees, actually 58 minutes in Taurus. So it's Uranus will be closely squaring the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction on December 20th, 2020. And of course, you know, we have Pluto close to this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So this is going to be a wild time. Plus, Mars will be squaring Pluto at that time too on December 20th, 2020. So pretty exciting times that we live in right now.
Aquarius, I believe, too, right? Where's Mars going to be?
Yes, that's right. I forgot that part. Of course, Saturn and Jupiter are conjunct at 0 degrees Aquarius with Uranus in a slightly wild.
Will be wild.
It will be a wild time, yes. And then Mars in square to Pluto at that time. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you. I mean, that made me laugh in a way because, you know, we didn't know about Uranus and Neptune and Pluto at one point because Saturn was the boundary of the solar system. But, you know, but it is deeply connected to the globalization when Uranus was sighted, because that's when people were actually beginning to move, like leave their country and move their families, or a boy whose father was a shoemaker, he didn't have to be a shoemaker. It really individuated people and the world itself, you know, so that the function of individuation, of becoming increasingly more of oneself, is always a surprise, because, you know, when we think of ourselves as changing, what we need to think about it is becoming more and more and more and more of who we are, and increasingly more individuated, which is what Uranus is all about. And Saturn doesn't really want that level of change to take place. I mean, if Saturn were conscious, mind you. But it is the boundary of the solar system, and therefore it was the sighting of Uranus that blew everything completely off the map when it comes to go back to the Mesopotamian period of time that Michael Bajan wrote about. Unfortunately, he died. He wrote about the Mesopotamian era, and I published that book with Penguin, and it was really fascinating to read the amount of information that was present in that time about the planetary array, but it all ended with Saturn. And so when Uranus was first sighted, it blew everything away from the 1700s on. People began to travel. There was more motion. They broke from the past. It had a lot to do with complete and utter shift in religious focus as well. And there was a tremendous amount of revolution going on, literally turning around about the way things were and the way things should be and the way they were going to be. And it did, it broke the whole system that we had that was fixed and very rigid and very tight. And it had to do with hierarchy. Whereas Uranus broke a lot of those systems down. Now, we won't go to Neptune and Pluto because they do different things. But the sighting of Uranus did, in fact, break down the system of the Saturnian, stay the same, don't change, keep it the same. And so now we're freed up, if you will, because of Uranus and the sighting of it. And it's incredibly eccentric orbit. I mean, it's got a bizarre orbit, and therefore it has everything to do with eccentricity, anything away from the center, right? So that whatever we do that's completely different than what we did yesterday is eccentric. Mm-hmm. And we can behave eccentrically in ways which are actually really positive, because it means you're not stuck in the center, but you're out more in the environment. Mm-hmm. And Uranus in Taurus.
Oh, sorry.
Gosh, it's imposing my Mercury. Oh dear. I guess I should start to fret and worry now for 7 years. Well, no, it'll pass.
No, you can develop a relationship of inspiration. I mean, it could be
one hopes, but yeah.
Oh, I would. And one thing I forgot to mention, which I think is really cool, I just learned that when they discovered Uranus, they also recognized that the distance between Uranus and Saturn is essentially the same, give or take a few million miles.
Right.
It expanded the solar system. So the distance between the Sun and Saturn is similar to the distance between Saturn and Uranus. So it's just like, wow, just, shocking.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's fantastic. Oh, okay. Definitely makes, yeah. I think somebody else has a question.
Yes, Erin, can you see the question in the chat?
No. Oh, in the chat. Let me just open it. Question is, Erin, you have had friends who have died, and some of whom were astrologers. If Pluto is death and rebirth, does it mean a terminally ill patient going through a heavy Pluto transit would be preparing for a rebirth in a new life rather than a rebirth occurring in the current life? I would have to say they would be preparing in death, because I've been present 3 times at the actual moment of the last exhalation, because that's it. You don't breathe in, you breathe out, and then you die. I'm not too sure about whether the rebirth will have to do with them rebirthing in a current life, because that's not possible. But certainly, I think that a person who's going through a Pluto transit, because one of the deaths that I did it was with, I saw something in the eyes as the person took their last breath and exhaled. And it was as if I was about to be told something really, really important. And they died. And it left me with the most astounding feeling that they saw something much bigger than any of us could ever see, and while we're still alive, because we're encased in our consciousness. But those last few minutes, especially if you are conscious at your death, it's very important, and it does actually alter the consciousness of the people who are in the presence of someone in that state. So I think the rebirth actually occurs with the person who survives.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks, Erin. Okay, we're approaching the end of the panel. How about any questions from our Zoom audience? Erin, do you have a summing up?
I don't really have a full summing up. I think that the way people went through the different pairs, to me, was really very educational. I mean, I saw things in different lights, as one does when someone is talking about, for instance, the sun moon is just one example. Where the sun is ego, shine, and passion, and the moon is the deep self, the unconscious, and the capacity to feel, not just think. And so, I mean, my final is that I learned a lot about what is being thought about in astrology, and that brings to my consciousness something bigger than it was in 2 hours ago. And I think that the fact that we have the sun, our ego, our I amness, and our shine, and our passion, and our self-possession, and excitement about life, and then the quietness of the moon, and the deep self, and the unconscious, and the capacity to feel, not just think, but to feel, is probably the thing that I've taken away from this particular session with people doing these pairs together.
Okay. Linda, you asked me to comment on something I was sharing earlier.
Yes, I rang the bell thinking that we had less time available, but we've got plenty of time. So would you like to continue what you were saying? Can you remember?
Let's see, what was
Pluto Mars, I think. I think it was Pluto Mars, wasn't it?
Yes, I was talking about Pluto Mars, and
I'm trying to remember, yeah.
With Pluto and with Mars, most of us tend to not want to deal with those energies. And remember, those energies are there for a reason. They tend to be traumatic when they're working together, but there's a purpose for that. And it is about transforming our consciousness. It's about helping us to evolve, because what we're all looking for is to know ourselves. And Pluto and Mars are pivotal, as are the other planets, in helping us to get to know who we really are. And to know who we are as a soul, really, we have to delve into the unconscious. We have to delve into that part of us that we are afraid of seeing and afraid of looking at. And that takes a lot of courage, which Mars is necessary, because that is where our courage comes from Mars, for good or for ill. And they're necessary for our evolution. I mean, they've been on the forefront of what we've been going through recently, because of course Pluto rules viruses. And if we choose to ignore Pluto and not do that work, then there's more darkness in store for us, darkness that we don't want to deal with. So it's much better to be proactive. It's always better to be proactive with Pluto. So anyway, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Thanks, Marie. And now we're going to hear from Michael Bartlett.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, everyone. What a wonderful expression of the planets. I mean, we all have our own vantage points, our own viewpoints, not only because of our own respective natal charts and the transits and the progressions we've experienced in our lifetime, but also the assembled knowledge and awareness of experience and reading and research and everything everyone's done here today is just really beautiful. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the people who attended. It's just always wonderful. I think in these times as we're moving into it, trying to find meaning, make meaning out of what seems absolute utter chaos is really important to all of us. And I think, astrology is definitely one of those great gifts that gives us that ongoing gift of understanding. Yes, Erin?
You've just brought up something, and that chaos is the origin of all things. because it was out of chaos that Uranus was born. Yeah, the god of the heavens.
Yeah.
And so chaos is actually the womb or the container for all that is to become and will become. So that was a perfect phrase that you used, Michael. You said that. It immediately brought to mind the whole concept of chaos and the great outburst of it when it became organized.
Because the goal isn't about controlling it, it's about learning how to be in relationship with it.
With the fact that it reorganizes on a very regular basis. And it's not always at our own timing. It's not always convenient, you know. And boy, that's really irritating for a fixed sign, is it? It's not happening under my orders. You know, this is not my job.
I did not sign up for this.
You signed up for this one.
Oh, I did, and I'm glad I did. Thanks for inviting me, and
Yeah.
thanks for, I feel very honored to be in this wonderful group of people. Thank you all.
Well,
Thanks,
I
Linda.
need
Great.
the same thing. Thank you. Thank you,
Any
everyone.
final comments from any of our speakers before we wind down?
There's one thing I just want to say, and I wasn't here to speak about Neptune, but I think the importance of trusting the divine consciousness, the divine intelligence behind all our incredible and difficult stories and so on, and that, in Pluto, the evolutionary force combined with Neptune, really allowing the intelligence to guide us to the new form that I believe is being birthed now. So Neptunian fashion, surrendering to divinity.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, what you have just defined. It seems to, I mean, at my age, which is not really ancient, but certainly it moves on. At 73, I've seen a lot of things and been through a lot and done a lot. It's been terribly exciting. But the fact is that I've always felt that instinctively that acceptance is the only way that you can ever get anywhere, is by accepting. I mean, if you can't accept a stoplight, you're going to get stopped by the cops, right? So if you can't accept the situation that you're in, then you're never ever going to be able to understand it or integrate it into the whole of your being. And so it becomes an object as opposed to an integrated experience. And I think that's what we've all been talking about this afternoon or later in the day. Today is integration of opposites.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this time together. I really appreciated getting a chance to see and know you all a little more, and really thankful for what we all were here to share and offer. Just one final comment thought that I had also was what Marie was saying. I was thinking about Mars and Pluto is to really get to know yourself. And I mean, I spoke on the sun moon today, and my understanding, which really has helped me with the evolutionary astrology paradigm, is the reason we incarnate is Pluto, this soul desire we have, and then we form this identity, and that brings that into focus, and as we have a sense of self of why we're here. But that just really resonates. So it's like to really get to know ourselves, like why did we even incarnate? Why are we even here? Which is why I love the Pluto material so much.
Yeah, I love the Pluto material too. I actually was, when years and years ago when Jeff wrote, I was the first person to read and to work with it, the book, and it absolutely really touched me, as a double Scorpio, it would. And so I had the honor of actually reading and editing and making some suggestions, some of which, of course, him being also, we have very charts that are very similar, except he's a year older than I am. So he had to go to Vietnam. I get to go to Woodstock. Big difference. Yeah. And so when the Pluto experience, that was the first thing that Jeff wrote about. And it is a phenomenal book. You know, it still resonates very deeply with me. And I only had one major correction that I figured he should make, and he didn't make it. And that's the way Jeff is. And I love him for it.
Erin, I have one question for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
Would you say that Saturn represents our incarnation, our physical body?
Yes.
Here in the world?
Yes, it's our container. It's how our soul is contained, is in this shape that has many, many forms, and none of them are the same. None of them. There are no two, not even twins. Their DNA develop at different rates, and there is a change. So yeah, I think that what you've just said is absolutely correct.
Okay, so if Saturn is our incarnation, what is the ultimate?
Incarnate, yeah, in the body, incarnate.
In the body, yes, in the body, like feeling all the physical humanness.
Oh,
yes, yes,
okay.
I know. So what is the ultimate deeper soul lesson of the Pluto in Capricorn transit?
I think that it is going to break a lot of systems, and that includes social and global systems. But for us as individuals, it is an opportunity to really explore the dark side of our own selves and to bring it into the light so that we can really look at it and enable to ourselves to touch it, if you will, like maybe manifest it in a physical kind of fashion, whether it's psychological or in reality, as a piece of art or something. We can actually use the energy that's there now to become increasingly more incarnate in our bodies instead of out of our minds in our bodies. And I think that's partly what this isolation is. You know, the isolation that we're going through right now is everybody is forced, absolutely, in many, many ways, to obey certain rules and regulations that were never, ever in place before. And so we're really doing it right now, is looking at our incarnation, our in the bodiness, and what we do with it and how we do it. Because now we have no excuse not to pay attention to it.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I also, you know, when I look at Pluto and Capricorn, when I think of Capricorn, Capricorn is culmination point, of course, because it's
death.
You know, it's 10th house, but it's also the mountain. And when I think of Capricorn, I think of climbing a mountain. And when I put it with, for me, when I put it with Pluto, to me, it's doing the deep psychological work, climbing that particular mountain, of doing the deep psychological work. That's what I see we have been doing since Pluto has been in Capricorn, so that we know when we get to Aquarius with Saturn going to be, you know, Saturn and Jupiter conjunct, we will know another mountain that we're going to climb, because Saturn, you know, Saturn still rules Capricorn as it does Aquarius. So I'm looking at, when I look at Pluto and Capricorn, I look at it as, okay, let's do the deep dive to do the psychological work, climb that mountain, so that when we get to the next mountain, we will have several choices and we'll have to choose which mountain we want to climb to get to the, what is called the pot of gold, because there is fool's gold too. So from 2008 to now, I see us as, of course, climbing or doing this deep work. Now we're almost at the end of this deep work. Actually, we're pretty close to the end. And now we will need to decide, okay, What do we want? What do we want to work for in the future? So that's how I'm also looking at it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I
Yeah.
think that's brought us to the end of this incredible panel discussion. What do you say, Erin?
I'm absolutely amazed. I think everybody's offered up something really good, and I love the latter part here where we're kind of closure about, you know, climbing the mountain to get to the top. I mean, that's the
To
only way.
add some final comments, if I may, too, just to
Yeah.
say thank you for everybody coming together and sharing what they did. I find that from listening from what's been gained today, that it's valuable resources to make your way in a very dark time and to ultimately come back into a place of light as best you can. That climbing the mountain, coming back with it with the best that can be made within these, you know, very trying and difficult times. So it's almost like saying they're tools to make a little light within the dark and to make the best possible. So I want to thank you for that. That to me is the best focus to have.
Well, thanks, David. That's wonderful. Really, truly, it's such a, you know, we really have had to work very hard in this time period, and we're doing, you know, we're doing the work. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of us have felt very anxious about doing this particular workshop just because of the times we're in. You know, it's been so long, and it's been very, very, very good. And the contribution of everyone, every single individual, has been unique and personal and collectively helping the unconscious of the world despite the way we think.
Great.
Okay, so Erin, we have your third panel discussion coming up on October the 8th, and the topic hasn't been set yet. So we're
Right.
just letting everyone know.
October 8th.
Yes, it's quite a way away.
Like one of my grandson's birthdays.
Oh, okay. So look, I'd like to thank Michael Bartlett, David Green, Marie O'Neill, Bradley Narrigan, Christina Hardy, and of course, thank you, Erin Sullivan, very much. Thank you all so much. Final words, Erin, and then we'll close down.
I wanted to just say to you, Linda, thank you for everything that you do and what you put into what our profession is meant to be, and that is a collective of consciousness, not just the collective unconscious, but the collective consciousness that you've brought us together so that we could have these panels. So I want to thank you personally for that.
It's my pleasure. I do have Uranus on the midheaven. I guess that could be it.
Yep, that'll make it. That'll do it.
What's
One ball for sure.
Okay, everyone. Thank you all so much. And
Bye. Thank you. Great meeting you all.
Erin.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.